Hi, thank you for making time to come today.
All right. I hope I say your name right because I know some people say Jean, some people say Jean.
Yeah, it's Jean.
Okay, good. Okay, good.
I've tricked many people with that.
No, that's fine. I know you have a French last name. That's fine.
Yeah, the last name's even harder.
Abshire.
Abshire, right? Very good.
That's right.
And you are, am I, Oris, is that correct?
Oris.
And Guillaume?
Guillaume. See?
Okay.
That's good.
We've done well by each other.
All right. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for signing for this conference, for this virtual conference. We are so glad to have you this afternoon, and we have with us Dr. Jean E. Abshire. Dr. Jean is the Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies and Chair of International Studies at Indiana University Southeast. In a project led by the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Democracy Project, she is also director of the IU Indiana University Southeast Global Civic Literacy Initiative. She teaches a range of courses in comparative politics and international relations, in which issues relating to globalization feature prominently. She is a two-time Fulbright Fellow. She has lived in Europe and traveled extensively for work and pleasure. She authored History of Singapore, Greenwood in 2011, looking at the political and economic development of Singapore through the lens of globalization. Dr. Jean will be our guest tonight to present this afternoon, to present on the last topic in the conference. We are so thrilled to have her with us. Your presenter is Dr. Oris Guillaume. I have a postdoctorate in international economics and policy, and also professor of economic and business at Georgia Highlands. Clearly the presentation is not about me, it's all about like Dr. Jean, who is gonna speak for us this afternoon on political aspect of globalization. Political aspect of globalization. Please welcome Dr. Jean Abshire.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be with you today and am looking forward to sharing what is oops, I just clicked the wrong button. You'd think after this long we'd have Zoom down, wouldn't you? But yet it's a struggle. So I'm going to, come on. There we go. I'm happy to be with you today. I'm excited to be able to talk with you about globalization. I think it's a super important topic, and let's get started because I have a lot to cover. So I'm going to start with basics. First of all, I think when we think about globalization, often we do really focus on the international business and trade aspects. And I've offered up the first definition here to highlight that it is actually much broader than that. And the second definition is the one I like better. The first one is so broad you can drive a truck through it, but I think it does highlight, again, just the breadth of the phenomenon and how many different things it touches. But I think the strength of the second definition is it focuses on the economic, cultural, political interdependence and integration. And those, I think, are really the two key words. It also focuses on, indeed, the liberalized international trade and innovations in technology that have shaped globalization. And then also this definition focuses on the many actors in globalization that also affect and shape it, including international institutions, corporations, governments, especially the US, international non-governmental organizations, and even individuals. And I'm going to come back and talk about a lot of that within that. So I'm going to continue to move forward. I wanted to touch on terminology just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I know we have a lot of different disciplines represented today, which I think is very cool and exciting. In the US, when we hear the term liberal, we often think about the left side of the political spectrum. But in political science talk, liberal means limited government. And that applies both to economic systems. So a liberal economy would be a primarily capitalist one, as well as limits on government and what it it can do with citizens, protecting citizens' freedoms and such as that. So I'm going to talk about liberal a lot, and I want you to have the limited government front of mind. And then I'm also going to talk about the rules-based international system. And that refers to what we developed, the international community with the US very much at the lead, developed after World War II, to try to give rules and structure and guidelines for how countries will hopefully behave, and give them spaces to work out conflicts before they escalate into war. And the Australian Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, I think succinctly highlighted kind of the three prongs of the rules-based international system. First is indeed the rules that protect sovereignty or the power of a country to act independently within its own borders, to preserve peace and curb excessive use of power, and with that to enable international trade and investment. A lot of this does always come back to that. Also, though, international standards, so common foundations that permit really the transportation, telecommunications, and other issues that underpin the global economy. And then also the norms that are part of our kind of shared global governance, where we think about universal human rights, gender equality, and also the rule of law, which is a term that I highlighted here because it's one that, again, I'm going to talk about again and again. And this is really, the rule of law is where is about the primacy of laws, where the law that is written and on the books is the highest thing. What happens is not subject to the individual whims or preferences of any powerful person, but the law prevails. And we have with that an equal application of the law to all people. It's a little bit idealistic, but it's the goal. I'm also going to lay out really explicitly here my argument, because it's kind of a big argument, and I'm going to meander around a little bit as I move through it, because there's a lot of pieces to it. So I wanted to get it out there, hopefully clearly and succinctly, sort of succinctly, from the top. So globalization has flourished in recent decades. We refer to it often as globalization 3.0, or trade in finished goods and increasingly services, through liberal trade policies with a rules-based international system as the foundation. This rules-based system is under threat from various sources, which will, along with the failings of globalization itself in individual countries, challenge globalization as we have known it, and very likely necessitate a reformulation of globalization. So again, there's a lot packed into that. So hopefully you can follow me all the way through. I'm counting on it. I'm going to start with Singapore as a case study. As Professor Guillaume mentioned, I have a book on the history of Singapore, and it is very much a look at Singapore through the lens of globalization. Singapore is a tiny, tiny little island country in Southeast Asia at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. It has really no natural resources other than an incredibly good deep water port. And that managed to give it a sort of an oversized role relative to its size in its ability to participate in our globalized world. When I say it's small, you can get across the country by train in literally about 45 minutes. So it's small. It was in the pre-colonial era, a stop on the maritime Silk Road. Again, that harbor, Chinese explorers and traders wrote about it in the 11 and 1200s. Once the Europeans arrived to colonize Southeast Asia, it became a British trading port, and the British retained control of Singapore until the late 1950s. At independence, Singapore really was presented with a challenge and an opportunity. It was a very, very poor, less developed country, again, without resources. And so the government was very clever and very strategic in its policies. They decided that beyond their port, their one resource was their human capital. And so they created policies to invite in corporations who would come in and invest, build factories, we call that foreign direct investment. That's something else that's going to come up again and again. Come and build factories that could utilize the Singaporean workforce at the skill level that they were at. So Singapore began, like many countries, with manufacturing garments and textiles and that sort of thing. But then the Singaporean government upped their game. They changed policies. They, again, ultimately, they actually created policies that forced out the low-skill garment production sort of businesses and investments, having before or right before that invested a lot of money in education and training into their workforce so that their workforce could do a higher skill sort of production. And that was focused on like basically simple mechanical assembly. Like at one point, most microwaves in the world were assembled in Singapore. And so they continued to repeat that cycle. They would, again, invest in the education and training of the workforce, move it to a higher level, create policies that pushed out the lower level of production, create policies to invite in foreign direct investment in a more sophisticated level of economic activity. And today they are an absolute powerhouse in financial services, which is high level in terms of education and the skills needed, as well as manufacturing of things that like high quality precision medical instruments and stuff like that. So they really move progressively to up their game, and very government guided, very strategic, intentional and step by step. And so Singapore has moved from being, again, among the poorer countries of the world to by the mid 2000s having a per capita gross domestic product actually higher than that of the United States. And that's a pretty impressive trajectory in the space of a few decades. So Singapore, despite all this government management, I've mentioned government management a lot, they nevertheless are repeatedly and consistently ranked as being one of the freest or most open economies in the world. Typically, often number one, if not that, then two or three. But it is nevertheless what we call an illiberal democracy. The government is not essentially democratic. They have elections, but they're not free, fair, or competitive. It is an extremely regulated society. Chewing gum is prohibited, for example, and you can be fined for carrying a particularly smelly tropical fruit on public transportation. People joke there that it's a fine state because you can be fined for so many different things. Drinking water in the subway is something that you can get a fine for. So it's a balance of a lot of economic freedom, but in terms of government freedom, not very much. And a lot of these points, the reason I wanted to introduce Singapore as a case study, just kind of starting out, is that a lot of these points are going to come up again and again, and Singapore serves as kind of an interesting reference point, I think. As Dr. Guillaume mentioned, I do have a book on Singapore that goes much more in depth in this stuff. I would encourage you to get it through a library, because I'll tell you the publisher set price is overpriced and I get like $1 from it, so it's not going to hurt me. Next, I wanted to delve in a little bit more deeply into what we call international political economy, which is the intersection of economics and politics, specifically liberal trade, export-led growth, and this rules-based order. So liberal trade policies are rooted in the promotion of a free trade philosophy. And one concept that's very important in that is comparative advantage. This is a concept that dates back to the earliest days of thinking about and philosophizing about free trade. The idea there is that some countries can produce some goods more effectively, more efficiently than others. For example, largely climate related, India does a much better job of producing mangoes compared to the US, where we do a whole lot better job of producing soybeans and corn. And that's a function of climate, but also referring back to the Singapore example, we can see different sort of comparative advantages through Singapore's different different economic paths and their foreign direct investment. A low skill workforce is one kind of comparative advantage. A high skill workforce is a different kind of comparative advantage. So the idea is that a country should produce whatever it's best at, whatever it has a comparative advantage in, and then it should trade with other countries to get the other things it needs that it doesn't produce, where they are being produced by countries who have a comparative advantage in that item. And through that, we can have the most efficient use of our international resources, human and material. And through trade, everybody can get what they need, and we can have optimized production and use of resources. So that's kind of the free trade philosophy. We have as part of the post-World War II era, especially considerable global cooperation to remove trade barriers. There are a variety of trade barriers. We often hear about tariffs, which are effectively import taxes, so making imported items more expensive. Sometimes we see quotas of like a certain amount of an item can be imported, or there are different kind of barriers. But there's been a tremendous amount of international cooperation to remove those trade barriers to encourage free trade. And we have created international organizations to facilitate that. Probably the best known is the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which was created in 1995 and replaced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was initiated in 1948. So again, right after World War II, that's the time period where we see so much of this work. And the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade basically was the same thing, trying to remove trade barriers. The World Trade Organization encompassed more areas of trade and also included a judicial element to deal with trade disputes. So that was an enhancement. The European Union, another very, very famous international organization, and easily, arguably, the most developed free trade organization in the world. Used to be 28 member states. Now there's 27 since Brexit, the departure of the United Kingdom from the EU. But the EU features a full free trade zone, which means the free movement of goods, services, people, labor, and capital around throughout the member states. We have other free trade agreements. Many people in the US know about NAFTA or the USMCA. The USMCA is basically a refinement of NAFTA done under the Trump administration, connecting the US, Mexico, and Canada. But these are everywhere around the world with varying degrees of depth and intensity. The Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, is another. There's a lot that have, again, been developed in the post-World War II period for cooperation and the development of an enhancement of free trade. Export-led growth is the next concept within international political economy that I want to focus on. I mentioned it in the context of Singapore. And again, this is economic development, so countries enhancing their wealth and levels of development by courting foreign direct investment so that they can produce goods for export. And Singapore, along with Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan, have really kind of been poster children, known as the Asian tigers, in successfully advancing their economies with export-led growth. I also want to mention China as an outstanding example of that. I think we often think about "quote unquote" communist China and wonder how much of a open economy that is. It has changed a lot. Certainly in the early decades under Chairman Mao, it was not at all a free trade kind of society. But after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping took over. He had a much more pragmatic approach to economics and trade, and he had a famous quotation: "It doesn't matter." I'm a cat lady, so I'm throwing this in. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. And the idea there is, I don't care what kind of economic system we have, as long as we develop economically and can feed our people, because at that point, China's population had been through famines and all kinds of terrible stuff, and they needed improvement. And so China really developed or embraced also this export-led growth, doing it very strategically, like Singapore. And I'm gonna kind of dig into that in a minute here too. But I want to show you a few examples, or a little bit of data, I mean, about the successes. This gives 1960 to 2011, comparing some other Asian economies and the US. But the big red line is Singapore. And you can see, you know, just after Singapore's independence, its per capita gross domestic product was about $2,500 a year. And then by, again, the kind of the mid-aughts, it had reached about $50,000 per capita per year, which is a tremendous growth rate and exceeding everybody else. And again, exceeding the US, which is, I think, a pretty, again, impressive accomplishment. Moving on to China, the Chinese government, with their shift for cats after 1979, they took a bunch of what had been fishing villages and created special economic zones, or SEZs, where they would have, again, very experimentally, where they would invite in foreign direct investment, and companies could come in and build factories and use the relatively cheap Chinese labor. And they've gotten a lot of foreign direct investment, and you can see the impact that it has made. This is from these two charts, just looking at inflows just, or in US dollars, sorry. And this looking at foreign direct investment as a percentage of China's gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total value of goods and services produced in a year. And this looks like it starts slow, although for the degree of transformation that China was undergoing at this point, I think that's maybe a little bit deceptive. But you can see that it really did take off, and China has gotten just vast sums of foreign direct investment to aid their growth and development. And for a long time, it was a meaningful portion of their GDP, although as their internal economy has strengthened, it's also declined. But I think that you can really see the amazing performance of China using export-led growth, looking at their gross domestic product from 1978, just as Deng Xiaoping was about to implement these policies, to, it's a little bit old, but it's a nice chart, 2012. Like that's amazing. And this has had real impacts on the lives of people. We've got some competing data here, but you can still see the general lines, again, from 1978 to the mid 2020s. This is the real annual wages of Chinese urban workers. This is transformational for the lives of the common people of China. And I think that's really important and noteworthy. So we have significant development within Asia using export-led growth, and again, a lot of government management of how that happens. Another element of this, of globalization and economic development, is something called structural adjustment, which is a development policy promoted by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which are both under the umbrella of the United Nations and very much led by the US and Europeans, as well as the US Treasury, which is so important in this that it actually kind of gets its own place in the list. They developed structural adjustment policies and started promoting them most intensively from the 1980s. And basically, these are requirements that are placed on poor countries in order to be able to get development assistance, loans, not gifts, but loans from the wealthy countries. And the first and most primary requirement is they have to open their economies for free trade. So the idea is that maybe they could have export-led growth, but they have to get rid of all trade barriers, throw open the doors, and expose their economies essentially to the world market. And again, free trade, participate in globalization. The second requirement with that is reducing the role of government in the economy, which means reducing spending. That's sometimes on pretty important things like education and health. And again, kind of looking at the Singapore case as a point of contrast, Singapore was able to grow and develop thanks to being able to dump tons of money in the education and training of its workforce, again, through increasing cycles of ever more sophisticated education and training. Whereas with structural adjustment policies, poorer countries are really limited in the amount of government spending that they can do for things like that. And then again, also reducing the role of government in the economy by getting rid of government-owned entities, which includes things like public utilities, electricity, and things like that, which are hard to provide on a competitive basis. In some cases, countries are forced to revalue their currencies if the international lenders feel like they're over or undervalued, and that can play havoc with common people's savings. And then the fourth big feature is transparency in financial dealings of the government, which is intended to stamp out corruption, and that's, I think, the best of the batch, honestly. And after decades of this and looking longitudinally over time at the successes of these policies, it's pretty clear that there are a lot of problems. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist who also used to be the chief economist of the World Bank, so really on the academic side, but also very hands-on on the practical side of this. He argues that many of these poorest countries lacked the regulatory capacity and the rule of law to do this well. So basically, the government just didn't have kind of the structures and strengths in place to be able to manage these policies being kind of dumped on them pretty abruptly. Just as one example, and it's an interesting case to read about if you wanted to look more in depth at it. The US under President Clinton required Haiti, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, required Haiti to undergo structural adjustment in the early 1990s, again, under President Clinton. And it has devastated Haiti's economy. And in fact, a few years ago, former President Clinton went back to Haiti and visited and literally issued an apology to the country because of the harms that the Haitian people and the Haitian economy and country state faced as a result of these structural adjustment policies. That's one anecdote, but there's a broader body of data that also supports that these can be pretty problematic policies, but they are all about trying to force poor countries into free trade as part of globalization. Intentions good, outcomes mixed. So trying to look at international political economy and the rules-based order, international organizations, again, like the World Trade Organization, European Union, and others, create and enforce trade rules that support globalization's trade. International organizations also regulate and facilitate the kind of logistical systems that allow other aspects of globalization. And again, that's relating to transport, telecommunications, internet, travel, all kinds of things that help make globalizations go. And it is these international organizations that are facilitating that. And then international organizations work with governments and global banks for development assistance that should help poorer countries participate in the global economy. And those governments try to offer regulations, rule of law, courts, and enforcement of contracts. Again, that's a complicated story. Next, I want to look at the political actors within globalization. Going back to that definition slide that I started with, we have international institutions, some of which I've mentioned, multinational corporations. We absolutely see those in political science as political actors, both through influencing policies, but also there's a concept of neo-colonialism that we can talk about during the discussion period if you'd like. National governments, which we in political science like to call states, are primary actors in this. And I've bolded it because that's where I want to really kind of focus on next. But also international non-governmental organizations, which are international interest groups, Save the Whales, Human Rights Watch, transnational movements, which can be religious movements or rights-based movements. We often do include multinational corporations in this category as well. And then also the darker sides of globalization, realistically, criminal terrorist organizations such as that. And then even individuals, because individuals can participate in the global system. Public opinion shapes the behavior and policies of both countries and corporations. We've seen some years ago, for example, Nike coming under popular public pressure to make sure that its production isn't sweatshop based, and that's individuals putting pressure on this corporation. So it's a wide group of actors, but again, I do want to focus on states and the types of governments that they have, because I think this is something that we're not really haven't been, I guess I should say, we're starting to talk about it, but haven't been talking about it maybe enough. And there's some assumptions behind that, and I'll come to that in a minute. In terms of types of governments, we have liberal democracies, again, limited government, which is the US, the Europeans, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, others, but that sort of country, where the rule of law prevails. There's enforcement of contracts and reliable regulation. And that creates a pretty inviting investment context, because it's secure and it's predictable. And if you're going to be, making agreements, contracts, trade agreements and contracts, like individual companies as well as countries, having predictability and stability and reliability, that's really desirable. Another very large category of countries are authoritarian political systems. And in these places, the law is secondary to people in terms of decision-making and what happens. So the people can be variable. It might be random dictator, it might be a king. We do still have a few of those. It might be a political party like the Chinese Communist Party. It might be a military junta, which is a military governing board. So different types of authoritarians, but in these places, the rule of law is typically weak. What happens is determined by the preferences of those people in power rather than what the law says. And that can make for very unexpected and capricious development sometimes. And also in these societies, corruption is often an issue, and that harms efficiency. It harms all kinds of stuff. And so that's a feature of authoritarianism that's pretty problematic. And then we have illiberal democracy, which again, I mentioned in reference to Singapore, where they have appearances of democracies. There's elections on a regular basis and multiple political parties, for example, but the elections are not really free, fair, and competitive. Rule of law and basic rights are not assured of prevailing. And the illiberal democracies are really a subset of authoritarian systems. It's a matter of degree and appearance rather than authenticity. But often illiberal democracies, partly because they are rising in number, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute too, do get set aside as a sort of a separate category sometimes. So what are the implications of these government types for globalizations? As I said a minute ago, I will argue that liberal democracies are probably generally safer investment and trade partners because, again, they're predictable and generally you know what you're going to get and what to expect because the rules prevail. What the law says is what you're going to get. Authoritarian and illiberal systems, it's pretty variable. China, for example, an authoritarian system has become, much more predictable with good enforcement of contracts and stuff like that. But a lot of these countries have a lot of issues with rule of law, regulatory enforcement that just adds a lot of uncertainty. Also, in authoritarian systems, the citizens, the people, are not well served by their governments. Very often there's less education, which is going to connect to less innovation and less entrepreneurship, which are absolutely fundamental to globalization. Just as one example, in 2016, France had more patents than the whole quote unquote Arab world. It's not a desirable term, but hopefully you know what I mean. And that's pretty telling, because population wise, that's crazy. And it's certainly not anything about the Arab world in terms of the people. These are the folks who invented numbers and the idea of zero. I mean, there's clearly capabilities there, a lot of good thinking possible, but there's also no democracy. And that really has a big effect on people's lives and what they can do. There's also, again, kind of underpinning all this, the issue of theory, or maybe we should just call it hope, that trade relations between democracies and non-democratic countries would promote democratization and good global citizenship of countries. We saw this in the US in our debate about giving, in the 1980s, about giving China what we call most favored nation, MFN status, which is a favorable trade status. I'm probably showing my age here, but I remember the debates and discussions, because, like, if we give China this trade status, enhancing trade will just help them come along to democracy. Well, many decades later, obviously not the case. We see it playing out in a lot of discussions just in recent weeks with the European Union countries, and their connecting their energy supplies to Russia, thinking if we have this close relationship with Russia, interdependence, they need us to buy their petroleum products, we need their petroleum products, that interdependence will tether Russia into better behavior. And we know from the invasion of Ukraine and the global mess that has wrought, that is really not the case. And tied with this, we have Thomas Friedman's theory that he presented in The World is Flat book from 2005, which is a real praise of globalization, and I think a real underestimation of some of the problems with it, what he called the Dell theory of conflict prevention, which was based on supply chains. And I know you heard about supply chains earlier today. The idea that basically countries in a supply chain will avoid conflict with each other, so we can minimize conflict, large scale and small scale, by connecting countries through supply chains. If a country within the same supply chain is going to have an issue with another country, there's going to be self-harm by fighting with that country. Well, again, the EU and Russia example, we found out that that's not really right. And so these were the hopes and the theories, but the reality really hasn't panned out. And again, the current events have I think illustrate that more than anything. But also, we have a situation here where there was the assumption, with all of these hopes and theories, that democracy was kind of the default. And that wasn't entirely madness, because we had decades where democracy was increasing worldwide, and it seemed to be on a nice trajectory. And political scientists, because we're really bad at predicting the future, really underestimated how far wrong that could go. And what we have now is a situation of really severe democratic backsliding, which is the next thing I want to talk about. 2021, according to Freedom House, which is a significant international think tank that looks at the health and well-being or not of democracy and freedom in the world, 2021 was the 16th consecutive year of declining global freedom. Last year, 60 countries experienced democratic decline. Their democratic institutions became weaker, while only 25 improved. And again, compared to most of the post-World War II era, that's just so different from what we were expecting. These declines have affected every single region of the world and affected all degrees of democracy. So less democratic countries have slid and become even less democratic. And the most democratic countries have slid and become less democratic. So just going downhill. Authoritarians are collaborating increasingly on suppressing democratic pressures. And in this climate of now quite a few years of decreasing democracy and increasing authoritarianism, we really see the norms, the expectations of how the world is going to work shifting toward, well, maybe authoritarianism is how things are going to be, rather than the expectation of democracy. And I think that's really troubling. So there is a complicated relationship between globalization and government types. Again, we have found plenty of evidence that empowered authoritarians, we thought they would democratize, we hoped they would democratize, they have not democratized. Also beyond that, one of the realities of globalization is increasing economic disparity. Wealthy people across the globe have become wealthier. We see this in the US, we see this in Singapore, we see it in Europe, we see it in other places, whereas the middle has kind of eroded. So we're ending up, certainly overall globally, like poverty has been improved, but there's been an erosion of the middle and a shift down. And that has led to a loss of confidence in democracy. We can see it in the US and various European countries. And with that, but also in the global South or poorer countries. We also see with that rising nationalist populism. So nationalism, the America first, Britain's better on its own outside of the European Union kind of thinking. And that is very much, both in fact and in rhetoric, a direct backlash to globalization. We see nationalist populist leaders all over the world blaming globalization for all the problems. And when people's lives are not improving, that can be a pretty compelling argument. And that has given sort of a spiraling rise again to increasing authoritarianism and illiberal democracy. So what are the implications of this? What do we make of it? First of all, well, let me just say, because I'm about to talk smack about globalization here. I'm a fan of globalization. It's not perfect. The pandemic was brought to us by globalization, and I'm certainly no fan of that. But I think it's pretty easy to make the case that in many ways, our daily lives, all of us, have been enhanced by globalization. I am able to get, a world of goods, probably better quality at affordable prices, thanks to trade. My life is enhanced by, the telecommunications and being able to listen to world music and watch, other countries. I didn't watch Squid Game, but that's in my mind. Other countries' TV shows and movies. That's all part of globalization. My life is enhanced by having international restaurants within, a few miles drive of my house. There's so much good about globalization. Also, a lot of not so good. We see increasing globalized repression. Freedom House, another study from earlier this year, indicated looking at 2014 to 2021, that there were over 700 direct physical incidents of one country going into another country and targeting dissidents, targeting people who disagree with their country, with their government and their policies, and that's quite a thing. We see also, and this is really important with globalization, the weakening of states. Since 1648, which is what political scientists understand to be the birth date of the modern international system, since 1648, states have really been at the center of the international system. And with globalization, we see a lot more essentially competition for power, many more actors and players who have influence on how the world works and the states themselves. Corporations, of course, these international organizations also, but it's a much more complex world for states, and some of our problems that they have to deal with today realistically are also just global problems. No individual, one country, one state is going to be able to cope with climate change. And so what we see is the ability of states to function and deliver to their citizens what they want and need is becoming increasingly difficult. And so states are less able to manage challenges, and bound up with that is also really a shift in global power centers. In political science, we call power centers in the international system poles. And during the Cold War, we had a bipolar world. It was the US and the Soviet Union, and really much of international relations revolved around those two power centers and their conflicts. The Soviet Union collapsed. We had a unipolar world. The US was really the one remaining big power, and we kind of kept an eye on things and kept things from getting out of control. World cop is kind of the phrase that's used sometimes, pluses and minuses to that. But that has become harder to maintain. And for many people, we certainly saw a rapid acceleration of this under the Trump administration, less desirable to maintain. The US really abdicated a lot of its power and prominence in terms of unipolarity and having that big power in the world. And so we see the shift to a multipolar world. There are many more power centers. Certainly China. The US is obviously still there, but the EU, Russia's trying, Saudi Arabia is rising, India is rising, and others. And in international relations theory, the more power centers you have, the less stable, the less reliable the world is. And there's a much greater likelihood of violent conflict where you've got power being more diffused and more competition among those powers. That's not a very inviting prospect in my mind. We also see the role of globalization in the erosion of democracy. As states are less able to manage things well and leave their citizens unhappier, we see the loss of legitimacy of governments. Also, in many places, increasing questions about capitalism, which is really the basis of free trade. And indeed, again, also questions about the rules-based international order. And these things together have really given us the world that we know. And then globalization is also tied again to current problems like pandemics, the pandemic, potentially more pandemics, and other globalized problems. But also globalization is under threat. Authoritarians have little interest in following rules, and this will lead to more instability, unpredictability that will harm globalization and rob us of some of the benefits. Authoritarians are often not great trade or global partners, especially if they feel like there's no one to box them in and they can do whatever they want. And again, the Russia invasion of Ukraine and the impacts on oil markets and prices and everything else is I think, an example of that. From 2008 to 2019, we actually saw declining world trade relative to global GDP declined by 5%. And in 2016 to 2019, kind of stopping then because everything went haywire with the pandemic, global long-term investment declined by half, that's a big deal. And that's also not entirely surprising because, again, we see rising national populism and they advocate for reversing free trade policies and very explicitly demonize globalization. I am almost done here. So what are the prospects for this from where we are? Political scientists hate doing crystal ball stuff. We're, as a discipline, really terrible at making predictions. So I'm just going to say this. I think we need domestic policy changes in countries all over the world that need to address the very genuine and legitimate economic pains that have been caused by globalization. I think we also need policy changes that will help re-legitimize democracy and the rules-based norms that we have been heretofore accustomed to. I think we also need global cooperation, and we've been hearing more about this in the recent weeks in response to the Russia situation too. Global cooperation is needed to support the rules-based international order and authoritarianism, and collectively work toward more globally beneficial policies for the common people in countries around the globe. I think we need new efforts to address global challenges in a meaningful and integrated way. Climate change, digital privacy, sometimes people refer to the rising digital era as globalization 4.0, but the privacy thing is a big deal. We've got a lot of global challenges that have to be met globally and not by any individual state. And then finally, a lot of the opponents of globalization talk about deglobalization. There is a new emerging literature from scholars who are trying to who are arguing for fixing globalization. Let me put it that way. Fixing globalization, making it better so we can draw the benefits and limit the negative side effects. New literature on reglobalization that I think is going to be something to keep an eye on. You will all be receiving a copy of my slides, so I've got citations and links here you can look at, and I just want to thank you for your time and attention. I'm looking forward to having a discussion about some of these things. I know I've thrown a lot at you very fast, a lot of ideas, and hopefully we've got a lot then to discuss.
All right, Dr. Jeans, thank you so much. We are so glad to have you. And
that was a lot, I know.
You are presenting one of my favorite topics, not because it was my major when
Awesome.
I did my degree, but I love what you said today, and I believe other people like it too. So, Barack Obama, the president, the former president, said globalization is a fact. Whether people wants to believe it or not is a fact, because of technology and because of internet today, because everything can be global. And we do understand people often refers to global market, global sport, global ideas, global news, global cooperation, as you said. And we can't thank you enough for the way you presented it. This is just like an easy topic for you. I mean, I can feel like you do not even need a PowerPoint to speak about the topic the way you share this with us, and then we're so glad to have you. Now it's time to open the platform to other people who has questions, comments, and concerns. You can unmute your microphone as Dr. Jeans makes herself available for you.
I know there's political scientists in the room, or I think there are, based on the list of participants I saw. So I'm happy for other people to step up to the bat and answer questions too.
Sure.
We've got
thank you. This is Dovia Lipo from Malcolm State University. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you for a very informative presentation. My question has to do with the US dollar in international transactions.
Yep.
We know that after World War II, the dollar really was mighty. And despite all the predictions, the dollar remained pretty strong. But now recently, with what happened in Ukraine, we've seen that we are kind of restricting the dollar. We're seeing more Russian reserve being used. And also, to some extent, I think China also, even though they are still very, very low in terms of the market share of international transactions, they have the potential of actually growing. So my question is, from your perspective, and again, I'm just kind of curious, what do you think is the future of the US dollar as far as market share of international transactions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not going to pretend that, that side of globalization is by any means my area of expertise. If there's other folks who know more, feel free to chime in. But I'm going to bet on the dollar. I think there's a lot of things that give the dollar still a lot of power and strength. The dollar, again, I keep coming back to the Russia-Ukraine thing. I just feel like it's, there's others who've said this, like it's changing the world, and I don't know how much. I think we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think I think we're at a decisive moment again. I feel like we've had a lot of decisive moments in the last couple of years. But I think that has really highlighted, obviously, the ongoing role of oil, despite our efforts to, create a greener global economy to save ourselves from climate change. The dollar is the currency for oil trade, and I don't see that changing. I don't see in any near proximity any other currencies that would be credible rivals. The European Union is struggling, and I don't see the euro as being reliably robust enough to challenge the primacy of the dollar. The yuan in China, it's not there yet, maybe someday, but I'm not betting on that either. The Japanese yen, I'm not seeing that. Like, I don't see a good competitor at this point. And so my money's still on the dollar. I'm taking my dollars and betting on dollars. Does that help?
Yes, I'm betting on the dollar as well, because international transactions still more than 60% of all international trade is in dollar. So yeah, I have the same view as you.
It's huge. Yeah.
We do have
Rachel
a
Lincoln
question
has
in
her
the
hand
chat for
raised.
you. Can you elaborate from Brogan Go? Can you elaborate your definition of rule-based world order? Does it mean the rules made by the West as use a model of rule abiding in international relations? Should it become like a liberal democracy a precondition of free trade?
What an interesting question. Yes. So I did say that the U.S. really wrote a lot of the rules, not alone, but very, very much very heavy hand in writing the rules. And so one of the criticisms is absolutely that this is a set of Western rules. I think that's I think it's a fair criticism. I think some of well, again, let me just say this. As much as some in the US like to criticize those rules, they were written to benefit us with, just enough for others that they could have some credibility and legitimacy. But, I think they are problematic. And I think in more in some areas than others, but I think they're complicated, and they're not always, culturally sensitive. They're not always, aligned to different realities on the ground. And so I think, I think it's complicated. I think that there's potential for non-Western countries to have more and more influence. But realistically, yeah, these are rules written by the West. Has the U.S. Does the U.S. abide by the rules? Yes and no. It depends when it suits us well. What are the nasty little, not secrets about international law, which is, how many of these, not all, but how many of these rules manifest. And the term sounds so big, like international law, like, ooh, that's big. The reality of international law is a lot of it is based on actually voluntary compliance. So if a country chooses to follow the rules, follow the law, they will, and good, they'll get international, applause. But if they choose to not, then also the enforcement mechanisms are very often really limited. There are some more in trade. As I said, the World Trade Organization has a judicial element, although that was weakened by the US under the Trump administration. The European Union has some authentic enforcement mechanisms, but a lot don't. So when you've got voluntary compliance for the US, but also for others, it is really problematic, and it's hard to think of a lot of these rules as being their guidelines. I think in my I think at the top I refer to them as guidelines, and I chose that word deliberately because they're not hardcore law. It's literally the equivalent of getting pulled over exceeding the speed limit on the interstate and just telling that officer, well, I choose not to respect 55 or 65 or whatever the speed limit is. I've decided that that doesn't apply to me and I don't want to follow it. And the officer just has to say, oh, okay. That's not law. That's not a rule. So it's very problematic. Should becoming a liberal democracy be a precondition of free trade? I think that's hard. And I think that we're going to not have much free trade if that's the case, especially with the way the world is going. I don't know. I like getting diverse, cheap goods from around the world. So I think it's complicated. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I guess I'm going to probably have to say no, because I think we can't. I think we can't force that on anybody.
Thank you, Jane. I think I've enjoyed your presentation very much. And I believe that a lot of people will learn from this. As a student of international business, I just wanted to ask this simple question here. I know you said you believe you still bet on the dollar, at least on the short run. But the top question here is that do you think U.S. is overplaying its hand in terms of the utilization of the power of the dollar in terms of global influence? And do you think the backfiring is going to happen, or it has already happened?
What was the last thing that you said? What has happened or what will happen or already happened?
In terms of backfiring, that's the utilization.
Backfiring. Okay, sorry,
Yeah,
I just couldn't hear for a second.
Particularly when we talk about sanctions, because the base of international sanctions U.S. is imposing on a whole bunch of countries is because of the dollar. So
yes, yeah. So I mean, this is one of the really tricky things about the international system, and that it goes back to the question that Bao Guo just asked too. Like, we don't have good enforcement mechanisms to make countries follow the rules of the road, and so we can entice, but often, what's the hill you die on? What are you going to go to war over? Because that's going to be the ultimate enforcement mechanism. And wars are costly in every single way. And, the international system was built to try to avoid wars and give alternatives to war. So that's not, we don't want that as our default. So sanctions are a crummy tool. Sanctions are restrictions that are put on a country who is, it's a little more complicated than this, but I'm just gonna say is behaving badly, put on that country by one or a group of other countries to try to coerce better behavior. And sanctions have a lousy track record. Looking at Iran, for example, the US has had sanctions on Iran since 1979. Well, okay, early months of 1980, since the Iran hostage crisis started. And, repeated US administrations have put more and more sanctions on Iran, both Republican and Democrat. It's been a bipartisan effort. Oof. And what has that got us? In 2012, working in collaboration with European countries, the US put on, and this is related to Iran's nuclear program, the US put on a much tougher set of sanctions. And those actually did succeed in bringing Iran to the negotiating table for the 2015 nuclear agreement. But that's kind of a rare exceptional success. Mostly sanctions hurt the local population and don't do much in terms of the government. And obviously we've got the sanctions in the context of Russia, and it's just hard to evaluate at this point. There's a lot of signs that they're not really working, although there's also the argument that they're a longer term project rather than short term. I don't know. I think sanctions are really tricky because I think if you want to avoid war, they're what you've got in terms of tools. We know they're not effective.
Well, I think beyond that is
But like, what are we going to do? Overplaying the hand, like, we're working in collaboration. When they're effective, we're working in collaboration with partners. The U.S. is often resented for that.
But I think it's a double-edged sword,
Yes.
in its description. So if you're ready to deal it out, then you should be ready to take it, that kind of situation. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, what do you think about this idea? Because I have been thinking in the sense that what we need is a world of peace, is a world where there is trade relations, where there is security, peace and security. And one of the instruments that NATO has is that Article 5, right? Which
Yep.
is supposed to help protect some nations who are members of that organization. So my thinking is that in order to really ensure global peace and the maintenance of properties and have good trade relations, why not introduce an Article 5 like situation in the General Assembly Charter of the United Nations?
There is actually so Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is basically the three musketeers, all for one and one for all. If one member is attacked, all the other members are supposed to respond to reverse that attack and right the wrong. And there, I want to say, oh boy, I want to say it's section 12, I may be wrong, section 12 of the UN treaty. There is also a collective security agreement in that. It was the basis of the collective Gulf War action against Iraq. So that is there, but that means going to war. And that's a hard choice that a lot of countries don't want to make. So that is in the UN treaty. There is a collective security provision there that has been used, but not often.
Okay, but you've had members of the security, well, now you're talking about Security Council, but you have members of the United Nations that have gone to war,
Yes.
with each other. And why is it that clause did not apply?
So the way that the UN works is complicated. The General Assembly, which is where everybody is represented with one person, one vote, doesn't have much power. The branch that has more power and would be the one to decide to invoke the collective security agreement, that is the Security Council, and talk about writing the rules in your favor. The rules of the UN Security Council, there's 15 members of the Security Council. 5 of them are permanent members. They just happen to be the 5 countries that won World War II. So the US, France, Britain, China, and Russia. Those 5 not only have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, they also have veto power. So you can have 14 countries on the UN Security Council saying, we've got to do something about Russia invading Ukraine. This is clearly a violation of international law. And it is. There is no question that that is a violation of international law. And Russia, of course, slaps down its veto, and the UN Security Council can do nothing. And there's a lot of talk consistently across decades about reforming both representation and some of the rules of the UN Security Council. But of course, the countries that have power and benefit from that power don't want to give up that power. And that includes the US, to be clear. But the UN is just often prevented from acting by powerful countries refusing to let it. Yeah.
Okay,
We do
we
have
do
two
have
hands up.
Rachel and
Yeah, Rachel's been waiting.
and also, but before Rachel, we have a questions from Dr. Woodward from the chat who asked this question. Do you think state guide capitalists such as the China and East Asian tiger model is the wave of the future with the US doing it more too? Immediately after you answer that, Rachel will piggyback.
Okay, Rachel, I'll try to keep it quick. I think that's also, everything's complicated. That's my standard answer. I think it's complicated. I think so. Economists who have advocated for free trade and really espoused all the benefits, and I would argue ignored a lot of the costs, focusing on the theory rather than the realities. They have said as an expectation that governments should basically create domestic policies that will help mitigate some of the harms, like re-educate, like in Singapore, re-education and employment support programs to help people whose jobs have been moved overseas, for example. But where that usually falls apart is competing domestic political interests. Some countries do it better than others. Obviously, the US is not too successful at that. We are almost ungovernable at this point. And that also makes me pretty pessimistic about the US following state-guided capitalism, because I think that would just run afoul of a lot of the, frankly, corporate interests that we have. Some corporations would win, but that leaves the government in the place of really deciding the winners and losers in the economy. And I think that's tricky in our political culture, or at least potentially deciding winners and losers in the economy. And I think that's tricky with our political culture. One feature of the Asian societies that is not a feature of US political culture is a much more collectivist attitude. A focus on the we rather than just the me. And I think that matters in this context. I think policies are shaped by the political cultures in which they're developed. And the US has, we've often called it rugged individualism. I actually think we've moved beyond that into maybe sociopathic individualism, but that's maybe another topic, but I'm not sure it'll fit with us. Rachel,
come on.
Hi.
Hi,
No
thank you for your
worries.
patience.
Sorry for waiting.
Oh, no problem.
After Rachel will be Jimmy Landers.
I would like to say thank you for the presentation. That was a lot of information, a lot of interesting information.
I hope it wasn't too fire hose.
I do have a question about Singapore. Since it is a fine state, is there a specific reason why it's a fine state? Like, is it because of their government, or is that just because it's the way it is?
Yes, it is the government. I mean, it's a very nice place. I've spent time there. I enjoy it very much. I recommend it as a very safe tourist destination with excellent food. But yeah, it's the government is very much about social control. It's such an interesting place. They're a diverse society and have had potential for ethnic conflict, and they have managed that through largely through social controls. But the government has, moved beyond that. I mean, there's a big focus on being like clean and tidy, and there's a lot of basic compliance with that. And I mean, like, it's not bad. It's nice to have clean subways, but when it's like, 90 degrees outside and 100% humidity, and you're worried about drinking a bottle of water in the subway because you might get fined, like my own experience, like that's a little crazy. But yeah, it's the government just exercising a lot of control again over the political system like restrictively one political party for sure, but also just maintaining broad social control, limiting media coverage, limiting assembly, dissent, and just they touch a lot of different areas.
That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but it is a nice place to visit.
I'll have to go visit once I get over my fear of planes.
Yeah, well, it's a long trip.
It's almost time. I don't know if Jimmy Landers, and then after that, we have the questions that Michael Porters. I'm very sorry I did not see your questions. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Immediately after Jimmy Landers, I will go on your questions, and then we will go for the closing and remarks. And thank you so much for being so patient. Okay, Michael, thank you so much.
I'll try
Now,
to keep my answers shorter. Sorry.
Jimmy Landers.
Hello, good afternoon. I enjoyed the presentation too. I have really enjoyed the presentation also. And my question deals with Bitcoin. And it's not just, what Bitcoin is going to do and all that. What I see is governments like El Salvador basing their money on Bitcoin, and they bought 420 Bitcoins at $60,000. And right now it's selling at 23. And also I see other big countries like China making it illegal to deal with Bitcoin and swearing that Bitcoin is going to zero. So my question is, with all these social mood swings and money that these governments are having, right? My question is, what do you think is actually taking place to cause this diversity in money as it is, with one government saying, hey, it's going to zero. Another government saying, hey, we just lost $40,000 per, $40,000 per Bitcoin, and we bought 420 of them or something like that. But we're not worried because we're thinking it's going back, but their government is actually in good position and they're based on the dollar, but now they've changed to basing their money on Bitcoin. So I see a lot of political issues, and I just don't know how they're going to deal with it when China's hollering, and it's a big country. We're going to see it zero. We're going to see it zero because we're restricting it over here. There's not going to be any more trade. So I just want to know, what is your thought on this?
So I'm not a cryptocurrency expert. Let me just say that. I understand why El Salvador, I think I wouldn't have done it, but I understand why they did it. Why El Salvador chose to make Bitcoin an official currency of the country, which is El Salvador's economy benefits very considerably from what are called remittances, which is people in the diaspora, El Salvadorans living abroad, working abroad, and sending money home. And Bitcoin is a way that they can do that easily and efficiently, and without the costs of financial transactions that you get with currency exchange. And so, again, I would never have gambled on something like cryptocurrency if it were me and I were running El Salvador or any other country, but I understand intellectually why they did it. Again, not a crypto expert. Crypto started out to be some unregulated thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it started out to be some unregulated thing, but I think that's harder to maintain. It's certainly a space where like nefarious things can happen. And it can be a space to finance and bankroll nefarious things, or to transfer money to pay for nefarious things. I'm not sure that China by itself could shut it down. I mean, China also blocks the internet with the Great Firewall of China. And I mean, they're very effective at managing their content. They have a huge censorship operation. But the internet exists elsewhere. So China can probably keep crypto out of China, but I don't think they're going to be able to shut it down the rest of the world.
Okay.
I would be wary.
I do not know if you can take only like maybe 2 minutes to answer that for us, because it's almost like it's past time for the closing remarks.
Yeah, I don't want to step on time. I'm sorry.
Now, and then if we can finish right on time, We do have a questions from Michael Porter with supply chain issue posing major problems since the pandemic and what has occurred in Ukraine, along with the decrease in global trade for the years you mentioned. Could you talk a little bit more about the push for deglobalization from some actors and whether we will expect more traction with deglobalization? Feel free to send a text to him in the chat if you prefer, no problem. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll make it super quick. So I mean, we see this from again, like national populists who oppose globalization just on an excessive nationalism basis. We've also heard it from the Biden administration, who has said, we need to have key production at home, like the ability to make face masks, which we needed for the pandemic. That is also part of deglobalization. I think the pandemic and the supply chain problems were a good reminder of how interdependent we are. And when things don't work, that's a huge problem. But I think that that's probably temporary. And I think that I hope, maybe I'm just hoping, that the benefits of globalization, I think they need to be adjusted, but I think the benefits of globalization are great enough that I hope it will outweigh deglobalization. But I think deglobalization, I mean, there's a logic and rationale to it, especially in the context of the pandemic, as you mentioned. So there might be more of that, but again, I think the powers behind the benefits of trade are real and authentic, and the benefits, I think, are real and authentic if managed well, which is what still has to happen.
All right, thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you so much for the presentation, and we're so glad you chose to be with us. And then we're so grateful for all the ideas and experience you share with us. And then we can